Good evening. My name is Peter Christian Eigner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all this evening to another Gotham Center event. If you're not familiar with us, as always, I invite you to learn more about us online at gothamcenter.org, where you can find nearly 1,000 essays, book reviews, event recordings, podcasts, digital exhibits, walking tours, and more on all things New York City history. So tonight, as part of our regular interview series featuring some of the best and most interesting research on New York City history, we'll be discussing David Viola's new book, You Have Unleashed a Storm, about New York City in America's greatest age of terrorism or political violence, the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s. For those of us who experienced 9/11, remember the events that follow, it may be that terrorism is a very contemporary or loaded phrase. But as Viola reminds us in this marvelous new book, it dates back at least until to the anarchist Wall Street bombings of the late Gilded Age in New York City. And terrorism really has been at the center of New York's life for a very long time. During the long 1960s, the city, however, experienced a wave of terrorism that was unprecedented in scope. Never before, never since have so many actors engaged in this act. And while scholars have largely focused on new left radicals like the Weather Underground, Viola finds in his research that terrorism was just as likely to emerge from the radical right and may have, in fact, originated there. So, and the response to it co-evolved. Apologies. And the response to terrorism similarly co-evolved. Greater actions by terrorists prompted more aggressive investigations by the NYPD and the FBI, which drove the actors in turn into a vicious circle, which ultimately led many of the prosecutors as well to land in legal trouble. So in the end, what we get from this marvelously written book is a far more complicated picture of this era in which New York City again is at the center. So with that, I hope you'll join me in welcoming our guest tonight, David Viola, who is extremely well suited to address this subject, a native of the city who holds a PhD in history from CUNY's graduate school and is professor at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. David is also an intelligence officer in the U.S. Navy Reserves, and the work that he has done for this book is really groundbreaking, opening up a huge store of new archival collections and declassified files, as well as preserved court records that give us a far more illuminating account of this subject and this era. So with that, David, please join me. It's great to see you again.
Hey, Peter, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for having me on tonight. And thanks for saying some positive things about the book. And I really appreciate it. And just to start off with, I just wanted to say it's really nice to be back here, virtually at least. The Graduate Center, as you mentioned, is where this book was born, where where I became whatever kind of a scholar I am, and where a lot of this research started. So, just downstairs from the Gotham Center at the Graduate Center's history department is kind of full circle. So it's great to be here, and thank you.
This is a long time in coming, and it's my pleasure. Like I said, I've looked forward to this book for a while, and enjoyed. We've had many conversations over the years about it. So
Indeed.
I'm glad that we can be having this conversation again in front of the Gotham Center audience. Thank you all for joining. I'm going to remind everyone now that we'll be having conversation for the next hour or so, but you can use the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen at any time to send in your questions, and we'll start taking those questions around 7:20, 7:30 or so. So, David, the first question is a pretty basic one. How did you get to this topic?
Yeah, so I think as you mentioned, I'm a New Yorker. My brother's just retired fireman. Some of my earliest experiences, I think, as seeing the world as an adult in New York are, first year of high school when the World Trade Center was bombed in 1993, and seeing friends in the pre-cell phone age scramble to try and find their parents who worked in Lower Manhattan, including a few whose parents worked in the World Trade Center. And then my very first job at a university on Chambers and West Broadway in the shadow of the World Trade Center on September 11th, and then losing friends in the Trade Center and the fire department becoming something of a second family. So I think that is unfortunately terrorism in New York City were formative events in my lifetime, and as I embarked on becoming this, engaging in history as a scholar, and then once I ended up at the Graduate Center, it became this kind of question, especially looking at some of the work that had come out then, including Beverly Gage's monumental work on the 1920 Wall Street bombing, looking at this history of the city that's been home to my family for 170 years almost now, and saying there's this age of anarchism in the teens and into 1920, and then there's this new age and what's happening in the middle, what's going on there. And I think that the question I embarked on first was, is there anything that was happening there, or did it dip out and come back? And the more I dug into it, the more I found that no, there's this really in kind of a remarkably insane era of terrorism that has kind of been papered over, right square in the middle of it, and just kept digging more and more into that. And the more I peeled back the layers of that onion, the more interesting and engaging I found it.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about New York in a second, but maybe it's worthwhile to ask a question just for our audience, some of whom will include scholars familiar with this. But what does that literature look like? What are the kinds of questions that scholars are looking at? I mean, as you said a second ago, um, when you look closely at some of these eras, it's hard not to see it, and yet, as we're going to talk about in a minute, this is not exactly something that people think of necessarily when they think of the late 60s or early 70s or some of those earlier periods. So where does this literature on terrorism or political violence, where does that kind of sit alongside other strands of historiography?
There wasn't, and I would say there isn't much scholarship on what was happening in the U.S. in this particular time period. There has been much more in the last 2 decades, I would say, scholarship and more popular writing on the Weather Underground. They've become who at the time were kind of boogeymen
Yeah,
of political violence, and in the years since have become kind of the like the forgotten rock stars of terrorism, and that's an awful way to put it, but they're the only ones who are remembered now in terms
yeah,
of this
yeah,
age.
yeah.
So it's kind of looking at, the Weather Underground and their ilk were there and are there in scholarship, but they were far, far from the only ones engaging in this kind of political violence. So I think outside of the Weather Underground, there's just not a whole lot there. Brian Burrow, who had become a friend as we were kind of both researching this at the time, wrote Days of Rage, that's about a decade old now, and had really dug into the Weather Underground version of it, and also unpacked some of the other actors that were there, and that's kind of it. There's just really not a lot of historiography there. I think that in the last several years, there's been between Kim Phillips Fine and Kathleen Belew, there's been some great scholarship sort of exploring the roots of the other side of the coin, like political activism and political radicalism and political violence from the right side of the American spectrum. So that's starting to get there now, and I still think that there is. I think Kim Phillips Fine had a decade ago written that there's still so much to unpack about that. And I think that people have started to do so. And I think that there's still a monumental amount of work that still have to be done to explore that.
Yeah, I don't know if I ever told you, I actually wrote my master's thesis at Fordham, where I watched the towers go down and also saw a lot of people lose people during this period on the Weather Underground.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and it's true as you say. I mean, I remember from my time in reading around the literature then too. They really have sort of crowded everyone out, um, and become kind of they kind of have this weird afterlife. I was in a bookshop a couple of blocks from here the other day and saw a Weather Underground book. Um, so why is that? Why have they crowded everyone out? Why is this history of terrorism not kind of part of New York City's history at this time? Why does it seem so forgotten?
So I think that part of that is that the Weather Underground had this mystique about them in the 60s and into the 70s that was both a product of how they engaged with the press when it was so, and I don't want to like
We
jump out
should
ahead
say,
of
just
them.
for some table setting for our audience, in case anyone doesn't know who these people are, the Weather Underground is this radical faction that comes out of the Students for the Democratic Society. And I'm speaking for you. You can profile them as you want, but a group of radicals who come out of a major mainstream group, a protest, anti-war Vietnam protest group, and then
Yeah, and thank you for that. That's exactly what I was about to say, and I feel bad for not having already done that, so I apologize for that. Just
no,
as just as you're saying, Peter. So, Students for a Democratic Society, early in the 1960s, the largest student protest organization in the country, right? And as the 60s progresses and becomes more volatile, I would say, whether or Students for Democratic Society kind of implodes catastrophically. And what emerges from those ashes is the Weatherman faction, which becomes a Weather Underground and moves from activism and then to violent activism in places like Chicago at what was called the Days of Rage, to then into bombings, into terrorism. So I think that they had this mystique about them. And in the years since, there's a great documentary I think in 2002 maybe, that won the Academy Award or was nominated for Best Documentary on the
Oh,
Weather Underground. Several former Weather Underground members and leaders have written books.
yeah,
At the time, even the likes of President Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover categorized all violent activism as weather underground type. They kind of became, the way to describe the era, because
yeah,
of course, in the eyes of those like Nixon and Hoover, everything bad that was happening was a factor of the political left, and of course not the political right, which, we can certainly talk about. Um, so I think that at the time and in the years since, you know, they have they have been elevated by others and they elevated themselves to this kind of, this position of representing political activism and political violence during that time, which they weren't. They weren't even the first to it. They weren't even the first radical leftists to start blowing things up in the 60s and the 70s.
yeah, yeah,
As I think I explore in the book, far from it. Bombs have been going off in New York and around, mostly in New York, but around the country for a couple of years before the first Weather Underground bombing that we can think of in Chicago, just in the days surrounding the Days of Rage.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, so I think that that's a big part of it. I also think that in terms of political violence as it emanates from the right in the United States. Collectively, and I don't know if this is intentionally or I'll leave that to others to decide really, but I think that we've kind of put political violence on the right in a box and set it aside because it hasn't really been deemed to be subversive, right? Uh, you know, Violence in support of wild things like socialism or communism or like protesting the government on the left, that seems like it's trying to undermine the American system. You get violence from other actors on the right that is kind of in support of these kind of conservative directions that the likes of Hoover or J. Edgar Hoover, FBI director for 50 years, as Beverly Gage again sort of points out, one of the most powerful Americans of the 20th century. Like, you have violent actors on the right who are doing things that are anti-communist, anti-left, and these are all the things that Nixon and Hoover and power makers and power holders in the 20th century, it's kind of the direction they went. Like these folks may not have wanted folks on the right to be blowing things up, but they didn't disagree with the direction they were going, if that makes any sense.
yeah. No, I mean, the Weather Underground's famous because they're targeting the Pentagon and State Department and these kind of symbols of American power, right? Wall Street buildings, and they see themselves as these Marxist revolutionaries partnered with these third world Marxist leaders or groups in the United States like the Panthers, and they kind of fit what, as you I think put well, is kind of the stereotyped terrorist in a different time, but it would have been odd to that would not have been the image that came to mind if you were standing in America in like 1963, right?
No, absolutely not. And I think the way that I put it in the book is that when there are other political actors that we talk about in the book, like the Minutemen, radical anti-communist, violent anti-communist activists in the United States, and John Birch Society, which by and large was not violent, but had these radical right ideas, and some individuals who were involved with the John Birch Society. Again, massive dues-paying anti-communist organization that probably had more than 100,000 members at its peak in the mid 60s, including hundreds of New York City police officers. You know, um, I think when you look at them, they didn't frighten you because they thought of they were fighting for what the same kind of America, sort of like conservative, mostly white, mostly male America that the likes of J. Edgar Hoover were fighting for. But when those types and those guys are first resorting to bombings in places like New York and like Birmingham that, you know, had so many bombings going off in the mid 60s that people were calling it Bombingham. People who would eventually join the Weather Underground were still in grade school when
Yeah.
those bombings were going off. So they were not first to the foray, far from it. And the reality is that you look at what the Weather Underground and their type starts to engage in the late 60s into the early 70s, and it's impossible to look at them and say they didn't learn some of that stuff from the guys who came before them first.
Yeah, I mean that's a very interesting point. I mean, I was going to just add to what you were saying, and I said 63, of course, because it's when JFK gets shot, and when JFK gets shot, the country really kind of embarks in a major way on the sort of love of conspiracy theory that we talk about so much, in the age of QAnon, and everything else on the dark web. But that was building on sentiment that was there already there kind of at the start of the administration, right? I mean, JFK gives that kind of famous speech in 1960 where he sort of makes an allusion to the John Birch Society, who you just talked about. The John Birch Society, again, for anyone who's not familiar with these groups, is a right-wing communist group that famously, as everyone sort of uses this line when they talk about the Birchers, thought that Eisenhower might have been a communist plant. That was the level of their sort of paranoia about the communist Soviet conspiracy.
Everyone was. Both the Dulles brothers in charge of CIA and State Department were communist plants as well. Everyone was a communist plant.
Yeah, which prompts even folks like William F. Buckley Jr. to kind of like try to like very forcefully write them out of the right-wing movement. And Yeah, so I mean, like if you're standing in America in 1963, like you're not thinking about the weather underground, you're thinking about groups like the Minutemen. And do you want to say a couple of words about the Minutemen while we're talking about that? Because it's one of the great stories in the book and one of the important sort of characters that we've kind of forgotten about as we've focused on groups like the Weathermen and left these other ones behind.
For sure, and I guess that's a great way to put it, and thank you. So there is John Birch Society on the radical, or certainly on the extreme right in the United States in the mid 60s. And then there are folks even to the right of them who think that John Birch Society are too soft on commies in the US and
Mm,
leftists on the US. And a lot of them end up in places and organizations like National Renaissance Party, which has its birth here in New York City. Straight up neo-Nazis, no other way to put it.
mm,
As far as I've been able to find out, they didn't engage in any bombings. But you also have the various clans around the United States. And then you have the Minutemen who kick off in the mid 1960s, very far to the right even of the Birch Society. One in terms of their conspiratorial thinking, everyone's commie, and they're all coming for us. And they're also much more prone to violence. And they engage in a bunch of violence throughout the United States, including terrorist plots and bombings here in New York City. And one of the very first cases that I was able to sort of peg on this timeline of the 60s becoming more rife with bombings here in New York was a case right around Halloween of 66, 65, when when New York Police Department, in conjunction with the FBI, rolls up a plot by the Minutemen to bomb several lefty red diaper, like sort of red diaper baby camps around the New York area and kind of firebomb them and burn them to the ground. They had previously been known to have firebombed also places like CPUSA, the headquarters of the Communist Party USA in Chelsea. And after this plot is broken up, several other Minutemen plots do go off where they have been, where we do know that they did bomb other things. And that plot, I think, and that sort of pegging that timeline and putting that flag in the sand there shows us a few things in the book. One, there's really not much left-wing violence before that.
mm,
This is still when This is still at the height of the civil rights movement when the peaceful approach to civil rights still reigned and still ruled the day. And this is at the height of Students for a Democratic Society and fully committed to nonviolence.
Yeah.
So this is before any of that comes up. It also, I think, showed on the other side of the coin, like what you were talking about and referencing earlier. It also shows some of this activity by organizations like NYPD and by the FBI and the kind of invasive political policing that is happening at the time. And we get views of both of those. One, in hindsight, we see, this political violence is starting to bubble up to the surface here in New York City. Of course, in the Deep South, political violence had already been sort of unleashed on civil rights activists in spades. But it's coming here now also. And on the other side of the coin, we start seeing there is this activity by the police department and the FBI into political activity and what would become political bombings. And that becomes kind of the and that becomes kind of the beginning of the next decade of terror here in New York.
Well, before we go further down this rabbit hole, let me ask a couple of questions that I think will give us a little extra context for that conversation. One, just to follow up on what you were saying before, why New York? Like, why are folks like the Minutemen? Is it again because, yeah, I think you're sort of hinting at it there that like it's the fact that the CPUSA is and these other sort of red diaper outfits. Is that the short of it?
I think that for organizations on the right, like the Minutemen, and for all of the characters in this book, and even coming forward into our own time and looking at, the tragedy and the horror of September 11th, I think the biggest part of the answer to that question of why New York is that New York is, I'm biased, I'm a New Yorker, but New York is the focus of the world, right? And that's why the Gotham Center has done some remarkable work. In the post World War II years, New York City becomes a financial capital and the cultural capital. And with the advent of the United Nations in 1950-51, it also becomes the capital of world governance.
Yeah.
Um, and the media capital of the world, of course. So terrorism being this intent to find an audience for your cause through violence, there is no bigger stage than New York City, period.
Which is something to add about groups like the Weather Underground. And I don't know if you would go so far as to say this, but maybe all the groups and that you're sort of profiling here is that they're small groups, like the Weather Underground. I can't remember, maybe off the top of your head, like what their estimated size was, but and they lied about it, of course, and made it seem like it was bigger. But they were, they're called Marxists, but I mean, it might be better off to call them anarchists because the whole approach that they took to politics, insofar as they had a politics, was this whole notion of the propaganda of the deed, right? That like like exploding a building like the Pentagon to make it seem like you're big and powerful, right? And then issuing these communiques where they would use all this kind of grandiose language and say like, we are the Revolutionary Front and blah blah blah, that was all predicated on this logic that there would be some sort of revolution that would follow from that, right? Insofar as there's a politics there, and not just some kind of, weird hobbyist virtue signaling or I don't know what. I mean, it's this notion that you're going to sort of inspire people and essentially create a movement, right? Or create copycats. I'm not sure um, that I'm not saying too much here, but that's the sort of the implication of the approach that the Weather Underground takes.
The Weather Underground takes that approach entirely, and they're really good propagandists. They're bad at some other things, but they're really good at their messaging and putting the right people in front of the cameras and in front of the radio broadcast, etc. But everybody's used New York for that. I mean, the Minutemen was not necessarily a New York organization. They're born completely elsewhere, and their centers of gravity are elsewhere. But there is no stage like New York, not
Yeah.
in 1965, not in 1975, and not in 2025. Literally a half century later, there is no stage like New York. And I think that some questions I've gotten at some points have been like a curiosity that, right-wing violence can even happen in a place as progressive and Democrat as New York. But we also, I think, make the mistake that of assuming that all of New York is cut from the same cloth. You know, there is great diversity in and around New York City, including, I mean, look at 64. LBJ sweeps every county in New York State. But the county that voted in the highest numbers for Goldwater was Staten Island, you know, and not denigrating
Well, I
Staten
mean,
Island or their
William
political
Buckley
choices.
famously runs for mayor, right? And that is this sort of signal event, right?
Yeah.
Uh, During the 60s, the height of the Great Society, it's a Republican, John Lindsay, or a liberal Republican, but a Republican who gets elected, right?
Yeah, two words you can't put together anymore, you know. But yeah, John Lindsay, a great progressive mayor of New York City, is a Republican, you know. And even when Goldwater loses fabulously to LBJ in 64, you know, they're still splitting the ticket in Nassau and Suffolk County, where the Minutemen are pretty strong, and they're voting LBJ, but they're also putting Republicans in Congress. So there is great diversity in New York, and I think that that's been a strength of New York. But I also think that that also allowed for a diversity of movements to grow up here. And look, it's the Minutemen, it's the Weather Underground because there is such a tremendous student activist population here in New York City in the 60s and 70s. But it's others that we're talking about in the book also, right? Cuban exiles leaving Castro's Cuba in the beginning of the 60s. They go primarily two places in the United States, the Miami area, and they come to what was then called Zona Norte, was like the New Jersey, New York City area. That is the other center of gravity for Cuban exiles in the late 60s. And that also I mean, talk about it in the book, but Cuban exile, anti-Castro, so very much not left-wing terrorism, is predates the Weather Underground, predates even the leftists who predate the Weather Underground, and Cuban exile, anti-Castro terrorism, you know, real concentrated in New York City as well as in Miami, but literally spans from the same actors are engaging in terrorist bombings in New York City and Chicago and Los Angeles. Probably other than anarchism, the only 20th century coast to coast terrorist campaign in the United States. And nobody knows it happened. We just completely forgot that it happened.
I mean, I'm thinking about this fantastic book that Max Page wrote some years ago called The City's End, where he details beautiful illustration too, just all the films and novels and comic books and other things like that. I've always imagined kind of this, and we still see this in Hollywood movies, right? The city that's always destroyed in the movie is always New York, right? And
Yeah.
it's New York becomes this sort of vessel for all these sort of social anxieties. But you know, I think what you're saying there, and I can't remember if Page sort of addresses this, but in terms of uh, uh, the sort of magnetism that the city has, it's you know it is this media capital, it's sort of the center of the stage for it all. So
It
uh,
really is. I mean, the way that I put it, and this is not at all to denigrate Middle America, but if a mailbox explodes on a street corner in Des Moines, it's, you know, notable. If a mailbox explodes in Times Square, it is front page news throughout the world.
yeah.
This is the media capital of the world. This is the focus of the world, um, for better or worse, for the last half century and plus.
So let's talk a little bit now about the other side of the coin is the law enforcement. So New York, which is this, it has always been this politically diverse place, where it has very important actors on the right as well as the left. Um, is also a city that has the largest police force in the country, the NYPD, and the largest office of the nation's leading law enforcement agency, the FBI, is also here in New York City. These are major actors in your story. Tell me about what they are, what are NYPD and FBI thinking about in terms of terrorism at the start of this story, and what do they get up to? And tell us what you found in your work.
For sure. And so again, for people who aren't familiar with the book, just to take it back a little bit. So the FBI, what starts out as a bureau investigation in the first Red Scare, with a very young 23, 24-year-old J. Edgar Hoover at the front of the radical division there. And some of their first jobs, Tim Weiner and Brian Burrow and a bunch of and Beverly Gage have really shown that some of the first jobs of the Bureau of Investigation and then the FBI is countering political radicals. And usually that meant the political left because nobody's paying as much attention to the political right. And the radical division that the FBI starts in the 19 teens and as during the age of anarchist bombings, it goes away, but it doesn't fully go away. And the FBI really doubles down on domestic intelligence in the years after, during World War II and after. So the FBI, they're not just investigating crimes as the 1960s start. It's this massive infrastructure led again by one of the most powerful Americans of the 20th century that is very invested in political intelligence. And that's not always intelligence to counter bad guys. Sometimes it's just unpopular politics as far as J. Edgar Hoover is concerned. And on the other side of the equation, you have the
I mean, Hoover at
NYPD.
that time too is just to add to the sake of the audience. I mean, there's this rivalry around the period of World War II where he wants FBI to be CIA, right? And so it's intelligence and there's actually overseas work that they're doing, right? It's why Dragnet, and he's linked up with other folks that go back all the way to like the Spanish-American War that have these lists on subversives in the country, and yeah, it's a major operation. But
Major operation. And before the CIA, and my hat as an intelligence professional, before the CIA emerges after the National Security Act, Hoover's expectation is that the FBI will take on not just domestic intelligence, but also foreign intelligence, and just be the intelligence apparatus for the government, period, full stop. That's not how it happens, but domestically, they are a massive intelligence apparatus with, as you point out, Peter, the largest field office outside of the headquarters in Washington, D.C., is the New York office. It's led by the most senior of all people who lead all of the field offices throughout the country. It is a huge apparatus, and it is invasive. It is very much engaging in political intelligence and and reaching out and touching and being very involved in the politics of New Yorkers as it is with American citizens everywhere. On the other side of that, you have the NYPD, which had been doing political intelligence and counter-radical, counter-subversive stuff, to be frank, even before the Bureau of Investigation exists. As the age of anarchism is beginning in the 1900s, after the assassination of President McKinley in 1901 by an anarchist in Buffalo, NYPD, even before the Bureau of Investigation exists in 1908, they're already doing that with, as an amazing scholar, generation past now, Frank Donner, explored in some of his groundbreaking work. These red squads exist at major police departments across the country to investigate Reds, to investigate leftists, and not just to investigate them, but in places like New York and Chicago and Los Angeles to infiltrate them with undercover operatives, to act as agents provocateurs, to smash them up, to create lists for them that can be shared with other organizations to blacklist them even. And I'm not trying to denigrate the modern NYPD. I have a lot of friends there, and I appreciate a lot of the work that they do. But NYPD 120 years ago is a different organization and doing things very differently than would be accepted now. And so they're already doing this by the time the Bureau of Investigation exists. Take that forward a step through the
I mean,
wartime years.
there's just also not the sort of legal apparatus that, right? A lot of that stuff is coming out of the Warren Court, right?
Yeah, I mean, there is so much that has changed the NYPD and even the FBI in years hence that to even call them the same thing is almost unfair to the modern day people who work at these organizations, to be honest. When you look at the Warren Commission and on the New York City on the NYPD side, Knapp Commission and there's a whole lot that I won't drag you through the details. But by the 1950s, in the post-war era, NYPD's political intelligence functionality had become really centralized in a unit that was at the time known as a Bureau of Special Services and Investigations, or BOSSI. and Bossy becomes synonymous with Red Squads here in New York City for a generation, and doing a lot of the same things that they had been that the FBI is doing: infiltration, heavy reliance on informants, but a lot of undercovers, a lot of like actual badged officers, and on the FBI side, special agents who are actually undercover in these organizations. And also, things like what we would call black bag jobs, infiltration of organizations' headquarters, stealing and surreptitious copying of their files, tapping their phones without cause and without warrant. A lot of very heavy political policing, not for, known activity that they were engaging in, in violence, but really unpopular politics. And that sets the stage by the 1960s. You have the FBI really heavily involved in political policing and political intelligence at a time before the FBI had lost its sheen for a lot of Americans. J. Edgar Hoover, by the early 1960s, mid 1960s, is one of the most popular Americans in the country. And then you have NYPD doing very similar things, and you have them in super close coordination. Um, I mean, the what exists today, the Joint Terrorism Task Force that brought together NYPD and FBI ostensibly in the 1980s. I mean, when I dig through the research, they were doing exactly the same thing
Mm.
by the early 1960s.
In an informal way.
Ooh, not even informal. You literally had FBI special agents who were posted at Bossy's offices.
And is that how does that come about? It's not coming about through some sort of legislative or executive mandate,
No, I mean, if
just
I
an
had
alignment of their work and their interests.
Yeah, there's a lot of value congruence between FBI and NYPD, and frankly, even between some of the political actors on the right. In
Sure.
1966, there was a big scandal, I think I'd referenced it earlier, when John Birch Society spokesperson claims that there's hundreds and hundreds of Birchers in NYPD, and nobody discounted it. The mayor at the time, John Lindsay, tried to do something about it, but as is their right, people of free association politically, there's nothing
Mhm.
you can do about it. John Birch Society was not wholly engaged in terrorism or bombings or anything like that. They were just pretty radical. Um, so yeah, there's value congruence between, and there's shared values between NYPD and FBI and some of these actors on the right. God forbid you had 500 members of the CPUSA or the Communist Party USA in NYPD in 1965, the place would have been burned to the ground. Um,
Sure.
but 500 Birchers, not such a big deal. But yeah, it's going back even before the book begins off, really. But during the wartime years, when NYPD and the World War II years, when NYPD and the FBI are really looking into wartime sabotage and wartime espionage, you know, I haven't looked at a lot of those records, I'll be honest, but I feel like the roots of the relationship really get cemented then.
That seems right to me. That seems right from everything I read. Um, uh, so I mean, and people kind of forget this, like, but it's kind of shocking how under the aegis of sort of emergency powers, the kind of license that groups like FBI had, right? So the one that I always kind of refer to people to is that there was an act of Congress that allowed that had set up detention centers. Do you know about this? That J. Hoover had the power in a national and with the declaration of a national emergency to take all the people on his list, which I think by the time of his death was, I mean, I can't even remember the number. It was an astronomical number, and basically put them all in detention centers in the center of the country.
Yeah, the I think what I referenced it in the book. When you look at on over the course of these kind of events of bombings and terrorism, political violence in the United States, more than 100 years ago to the era of anarchism, smack in the middle of it in that time that I'm exploring here in the book. And then you look at the 9/11 years, there's always been this there's always been this warning from some of our leaders that, you know, you have to trade some of your liberties for safety. You know, um, the civil liberties they're just going to result in more bombers coming after you, and it's
Right.
it's never necessarily worked out that way.
Yeah.
9/11 happened not because of our civil liberties. And the case that I make in this book is that, this strangulation of a lot of civil liberties that was happening in the beginning of the 60s didn't prevent this era of political violence from happening. And if anything, as the FBI and the NYPD and other actors are starting to get restrained because some of their more egregious excesses are coming to light, as they're being restrained, is actually when the era of political violence is coming to an end or this era of political violence is coming to an end. So that's always been the warning that, you have to trade your civil liberties for safety, but it's a slippery slope. And I think that we're actually potentially entering another one of those now.
Yeah. Well, you talk about this vicious cycle that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Between the actions that these groups take and then the response from FBI, NYPD, and other groups, where they're both sort of upping the ante. And again, for folks who are less familiar with this period, the scale of infiltration was sometimes immense, right? So uh, there's this sort of famous anecdote, I think from the Panthers or something like that, where they claim that like one in every two members was an FBI plant, right? And that was kind of the scale of it. And it induces this paranoia, and that was part of the intention to induce paranoia. I think Tim Weiner talks about this in his book about they were intentionally trying to induce paranoia among these people, which ironically then sort of encourages folks like the Weather Underground to start thinking in terms of wilder acts, right? And then just kind of escalates the whole thing up and up. So you talk about that dynamic. So share with us a little bit of that dynamic of the story.
For sure. So first I'll mention what you're talking about is totally accurate. It's one of these files that came out in this famous break-in in Media, Pennsylvania, when a bunch of war activists broke into an FBI office and just literally made off with every single file there and made them public. But was this file on that sort of was the first chink in the armor to release information on the FBI's counterintelligence programs, COINTELPRO, probably the most egregious domestic intelligence activity in our history, but it was an actual FBI directive to make activists feel, this is almost a quote, like there is an FBI agent behind every mailbox, instilling political organizations with paranoia was the intent of these programs. So you're 100% right. And yeah, so like unfortunately, you look at in the years that I'm talking about, as they escalate from the late 60s into the late 1970s, and these, you know, the political violence really becomes more extreme. And, I think it comes down to like the reality is in a place like New York, when everything is happening in these years, and a whole bunch of great scholarship on New York in that time, from Kim Phillips' Fine Fear City to The Bronx is Burning to the birth of hip hop, everything is happening, right?
Yeah.
And I really do think that some of these bombings, United Nations offices or banks that might be associated with Castro or whatever it might be that are claiming no lives and damage, but not catastrophic damage, they're starting to get buried into the papers, right? So the ante starts to get upped, and it becomes a more deadly era as the 1970s progresses and as more actors are clamoring for more front page space, to be honest. And I think that what you're talking about and sort of like this coevolution between the authorities and the bombers is absolutely true. The Weather Underground, again, not to go back to the same well, but they're the perfect example of it. The FBI and the NYPD are clamping down so hard on activists on the left, including the Weather Underground, that's what forces them to go underground, and then because they are so good at being underground that the FBI is now violating more civil liberties to try and go get them. And at the end of the day, what that results in is the Weather Underground really being far under there as underground as any organization that was engaging this kind of violence through the 1970s. And the FBI trying so hard to go catch them that instead of the Weather Underground leaders going to jail, it's quite literally senior leadership of the FBI being indicted for crimes, violation of civil liberties to try and go get them. So mind-boggling shift of where the focus is. Very similar to what happens in the Palmer raids. Americans
Mhm.
during the Palmer
Is it?
raids. Go ahead. Sorry, Peter, go ahead.
No, no, that's really interesting. And for sake and just to, again for our audience, the Palmer raids were the affair you were talking about earlier after around World War I, where the first Red Scare, where J. Edgar Hoover gets to start an FBI, and they're rounding up all the radicals of the old left or the progressive era left.
Yeah, and by and large, Americans were pretty supportive of that in 1919, 1920, when anarchist bombs were going off all over the place. But as the Palmer raids and the Red Scare in the 1919, 1920 really get excessive, Americans start to be like, wait a minute, this is going too far. And that's kind of what starts to happen in the 1970s. You have massive investigations of the entire intelligence community, including the FBI's domestic intelligence operations, in the Senate Church Committee and in the House, and on the local side. And I'll just tell the story really quickly of what you're talking about. The massive NYPD infiltration of the Panthers results in 21 Black Panthers being arrested in 1969, and huge front page, um, announcement of this widespread plot to bomb a whole bunch of stuff throughout New York City by the district attorney, Frank Hogan, at the time, um, results in a case that reveals several NYPD undercovers who had infiltrated the Panthers, and every single one of the Panthers who ultimately made it to trials, 13 of them, being acquitted of every single one of the charges. Not necessarily because the jury thought that they had done nothing. A lot of the jury thought that maybe they had done something, but that the excesses of NYPD so far outweighed anything the Panthers might have done that nothing short of a full acquittal was going to suffice. So you kind of have this pendulum swinging, just like it did in the Palmer raids and the Red Scare, kind of doing the same thing in the 1970s with what's happening here in New York and also at the federal level.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I mean, one anecdote I'll tell about that is, how deep the penetrations were that you're talking about, Peter. One of the primary undercover officers who was responsible for the Panther 21 arrest, um, detective by the name of Gene Roberts, a Black American, was so ensconced in the movement here in New York that he was literally on Malcolm X's security detail the day that Malcolm was shot. And these famous photos of a man giving Malcolm, trying to keep him alive, trying to give him a CPR. That's Gene Roberts. That's an
that's right.
NYPD bossy detective.
Yeah,
End up in these like famous photos of a man trying to save Malcolm's life from his security detail. That's an NYPD detective who was sent to infiltrate him.
yeah,
So the penetration was massive.
yeah,
And after the Panther 21 case is after they're all acquitted, literally the same week, a class action lawsuit that becomes known as Hanshu is filed against NYPD, against Bossy, against the mayor, against what it was even a pretty progressive police commissioner at the time, Patrick Murphy, alleging these massive, widespread violations of civil liberties. And the police department frankly doesn't dispute that they were happening. They just
yeah.
dispute that they were illegal. So the pendulum swings.
Well, and so is it? How does that play out then? Are there laws that are passed? Is it you know you're kind of referring to a historical pattern. Is this a thing that can be solved with law, or to the extent that these things get solved? What's your sense of that?
Yeah, I don't want to bog you down in the minutia of the laws, but by the late 1960s and into the 70s, in the wake of the Panther case, there is increasing calls for greater restrictions on the police department's intelligence activities, including also coming not for nothing from the commissioner of the NYPD, from Patrick Murphy, who also thought that Bossy was kind of a little fiefdom in the detectives bureau where even he didn't have insight into what was happening. That's scary when the police commissioner doesn't really know what their own organization is doing.
I mean,
Um,
that's how we got Watergate because Mark felt he was getting cut out by Nixon, right?
Mark Felt also, by the way, indicted for investigating the weathermen. So
Mark
it's
felt the hero of Watergate, who was J. Edgar Hoover's right hand for many years. Yeah.
yeah, deep throat, deep throat. Yeah, it's a weird little circle in this decade, where some of the same strange players are pulling strings and then getting their strings pulled.
Yeah.
But the Handshoe class action lawsuit does result in a settlement where there is much greater restrictions on the political intelligence activities of the NYPD, and that gets loosened again in the wake of 9/11. And that is kind of how you end up with a modern NYPD Intelligence and Counterterrorism Bureau, which just like bossy was in the 60s and 70s, NYPD intelligence today is most the largest, most effective non-federal intelligence activity in the United States. Not doing the things that Bossy was doing categorically. So NYPD does give up some of this activity. You've got a pretty progressive commissioner at the time who was willing to move in that direction rather than fight it tooth and nail. So NYPD does move in that direction, which the case I make in the book is part of the reason why no NYPD officers or leadership ends up, at the court docket having to defend themselves in criminal trial. The FBI goes the other direction. The FBI, even after Hoover's death, um, doesn't really want to engage in doesn't want to fully engage in greater restriction of their political activities. They even start an organization by the name of within the FBI's New York office that they dub Squad 47 to go and track down the Weather Underground. And it is the activities of that squad that is specifically why the NYPD or why the FBI, why senior leadership of the FBI end up being indicted for crimes and violations of civil liberties. And it would happen in other places. Some of the other actors that we're talking about, that I talk about in the book, like the Jewish Defense League, a pretty radical rabbi from Brooklyn by the name of Meir Kahane, who starts engaging in pushes his organization not just from sort of vocal and vigorous protest, but then into bombings, including deadly bombings.
Mhm.
Um, like the lawsuits, the criminal cases against the Jewish Defense League and the JDL, as they're called, end up getting tossed out because warrantless wiretapping, et cetera, et cetera. And the FBI kind of doubles down, at least when it comes to the Weather Underground, and saying we're going to get these guys and gals by any means necessary. And NYPD didn't do that. NYPD sort of took their lumps and took the restrictions that were aimed at them, and they engaged differently. FBI senior leadership, at least, they said we're going to go by any means necessary to find these guys and gals.
I mean, there's a similar arc with CIA. I mean, thinking back to both of Weiner's books, Tim Weiner of the New York Times, who wrote fantastic books on FBI and CIA. Um, uh, Thinking about that, so much of what we know about the dirty tricks of CIA in this era and later periods comes from whistleblowers. I mean, like virtually all of it. There was nothing by way of like scholarship about this stuff until, very recently. Um, do we see something similar with the actors in your story?
No, not so much. Not so much.
And there's a very high cost for whistleblowing always, which is maybe, yeah.
So a lot of some folks who are with us tonight, and by the way, if I haven't said it before, thanks everybody for joining us on a cold Monday night. Um, but some of y'all might be familiar with the Al Pacino movie Serpico, which is happening in tandem to some of this stuff. What Serpico, the real life, Serpico, sort of what as a whistleblower to NYPD, what he revealed was massive amounts of corruption within NYPD, not necessarily political intelligence and invasiveness, but just corruption, just
Yeah, street
blanket
level.
corruption.
Yeah.
And, Serpico's life was on the line because of being a whistleblower, and this is happening literally in the same days and months that the story I'm telling is happening here. So NYPD is having a pretty bad decade, to be honest, as 1969 turns into 1970s. Things are not going well between budget cuts and the corruption investigations and the hand shoe trial looking at their violations of civil liberties. Things are just not going well at all at NYPD. Um, and on the FBI side, yeah, I mean there is, of course, there's Mark Felt, senior leader of the FBI. I think he was deputy director at the time, who is a whistleblower, but it's more about Watergate, as you mentioned, and not about the things that he actually got indicted for, which were, violations of civil liberties in chasing down these terrorist bombers. So a lot of that does come. There's a great story. I think Betty Metzger wrote the book on it 10, 15 years ago about a break-in that I referenced earlier. A bunch of anti-war activists broke into an FBI office, a resident agent office small office in Media, Pennsylvania, and literally stole every single record in every single file cabinet and started making as many as they could available to the public. And that is eventually what I forget where the journalist was from, just saw COINTELPRO listed on one document and dove into that rabbit hole and Freedom of Information Act later, and that starts to unravel what is happening in terms of COINTELPRO and the FBI's domestic intelligence activities. But this is a bad time also for CIA overseas, and it's a bad time for the American military machine, which I'm now a part of, so it's hard for me to knock them also. But the My massacres just happened in Vietnam. So trust in the government at the federal level and at the local level is pretty darn low in the early 1970s. So, and that is where you have the political capital for investigations of these activities, like the Hanshu class action in New York and like the Church Committee at Senate on the federal level.
I mean, the person that I wrote a biography of, Daniel Patrick Moynihan's, spent the last great sort of campaign of his career was to try to do something about secrecy in government, and specifically because he was had after many years in which he had literally gotten medals from CIA for his work supporting them, and in some cases, I regret to say, very wrongly was doing everything in his power to try to rein them in. And uh, you know, what came out of that dismal failure was the lesson that secrecy really is the heart of the whole apparatus, right? That's where the power lies. It's in the mystique that these agencies cultivated, and in the argument that they need to be secretive, because that hides, the corruption that is created by all that is covered. There's covered up by that sort of thing. I don't know if you have thoughts and feelings on that, but
It's just wild to think that you need secrecy to cover up corruption. Um, and look, I'm an intelligence professional. I understand the world of secrets moderately well. Um, but the idea that you need more secrets to cover up cover up bad stuff is, I don't know that history has borne that out. Certainly not American history.
yeah. Well, okay, so let's talk about, we're getting close to the Q&A from the audience. I'm going to remind everyone to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen if you have questions for our speaker. David, it's been a great conversation.
Thanks, Peter.
Let's talk about today. Your period is the long 1960s, as scholars call it. Um, Today when we talk about political violence, people are talking about Jan 6, they're talking about assassination attempts on President Trump, they're talking about Kirk and all these other sorts of things. What are the similarities that you see having studied this period? Are we going to see bombs on the New York City streets again? How do you see agencies responding? How do you see this cycle and abuse of power, all of it?
I think that so I think we talked about it, or no no two eras in history are exactly the same, right? But there are disconcerting similarities certainly between the 1960s and today in a lot of things that you mentioned, and certainly in political assassinations. You look at these really scary years between Martin Luther King and JFK and RFK and Medgar Evers and Malcolm. And it's really shocking to see how short of a time period that is. And now you see these assassinations and attempts that have happened just in the past year in the United States of leaders on the left and leaders on the right and political leaders, assassination attempts on Trump, and then attempts on non-political but pretty political people like Charlie Kirk. Those are ringing pretty similarly. What we haven't seen is bombs start ringing out. And two things. Well, first of all, like in 1965, and one of the very colorful NYPD characters in the book makes the observation that it's easy to buy baby formula in New Hampshire as it was to buy dynamite in 1969, right? So it makes it a lot easier to go bombing stuff in the 60s than it is now, where you have to find a formula to create your own explosives. So that is one part of it. I think that if, there are probably people who, if they can go down the block and buy some dynamite, maybe they're not going to be doing some of these very catastrophic bombings, but knock on wood, does that mean that a stick of dynamite wouldn't end up in a National Guard vehicle parked on the National Mall, or tossed into Charlie Kirk rally? I don't know, but I'm glad that it's not happening. If it does start happening, I won't be too surprised. I won't be too surprised if we do go that way. And a lot of what I talk about in the book is that success breeds imitation,
Yeah.
and you don't. It doesn't need to be somebody who you agree with politically or ideologically, but if you see someone light a bomb and they get on the front page with their political thoughts, that makes you think, hey, I can do that too. I can get my politics on the front page with a bomb. So unfortunately, I think if bombs do start happening, because we don't necessarily have the most mature political leaders at the moment, it would be hard to keep the rhetoric down enough to quiet that down. So I'm scared of that happening.
Yeah, I was having a conversation the other day with someone and thinking about this book that Michael Katz wrote called "Why Don't More American Cities Burn?" And I think he was speaking to this kind of debate among criminologists about sort of trying to make a science out of what leads to things like a riot, right? We have this understanding that, say, poverty sort of creates certain conditions, crime, et cetera, and it might then sort of spark into but it doesn't quite sort of pan out in a one-to-one way historically. And I gather there's something sort of similar here with the copycat theory, right? That if that kind of to the anarchist point, right? Uh that you can sort of start a fire, right? This was the sort of and the Bolsheviks were sort of into this too. That was what they call their paper, the spark. Um is that the sense among theorists, criminologists on this subject?
I, I I don't want to I don't want to get too much into the criminology aspect of it. It's probably getting too
Sure,
deep than
sure,
I should.
sure.
I would just look at it historically, and even just like talked about in the book, um, I'll take two parallels, for instance. You take the most uh, the most prominent of the anti-Castro Cuban exile groups that I talk about in the book. It's a loose group, but it's a group by the name of Cuban Power, Poder Cubano. And you look at their bombings in 1968 in New York City, and these guys are rabidly anti-Castro. They are veterans of the Bay of Pigs. Um, their bombings in 1968, one year later, was a anti anti-Vietnam radical leftist by the name of Sam Melville, who embarks on his own bombing campaign with some of his compatriots, probably about a dozen of his compatriots. And they are carbon copies of one another. You know, if you take the dates off, you can't even tell that the bombings are not, that the newspaper headlines are not about the same exact bombings.
Yeah.
You know, they are learning, and Sam Melville and his compatriots are learning, from unless they literally had their head in the sand and were ignoring the world, which they're very clearly not because of their politics. It's impossible for them to not be seeing and learning from people who are the complete opposite end of the political spectrum. So they are learning, and I wouldn't necessarily call them copycats so much as the fact that there are learning points. So even Meir Kahane, the radical rabbi who started the Jewish Defense League, a journalist even asked him in 71, 72 if he was taking notice of these other bombings. And he says something to the effect of the Talmud says the wise man learns from everyone, and
Sure.
so there is a lot of learning happening here, even if it's kind of passive, being like, I hate those sons of bitches, but they're on the front page, you know?
This is maybe a bit of a weird comparison, but it makes me think about the way in which the George McGovern campaign, very different from Barry Goldwater, was quite copying quite a lot of his tactics with great success in 72. I think you see that kind of copying across left and right all the time. Um, Okay, so we're getting some questions from the audience. I'm going to encourage people to send in more as we talk. But the first one is about decentering New York a bit. Do we have a sense whether this is just the New York story, or are there other things, other cities that are important? He threw out the examples of Oakland or Paris. Oakland, of course, for the Panthers.
Totally. Super, super. I appreciate that question. It's a great one. I am a New Yorker, and I know that my bias is New York. Um, but I've also looked at the metrics. There's the Start Center for Terrorism Studies. It's used to be nonpartisan. I don't know what it is now. But even just their analysis of looking at the metrics of what we would call terrorism and bombings in the United States going back at least until the early 70s, you look at the actual metrics, and it's not just that New York City's experiencing more of this kind of violence, but it's that Manhattan itself, not to include the rest of the counties of New York, the boroughs of the counties, more than any other city in the country. Nowhere's a close second. I think San Francisco, because another hub of weather underground type activity in 1970, 71 is experiencing some. But this is a nationwide problem. Nowhere is it happening the way it's happening in New York. But you do have bombs going off in Chicago. You do have bombs going off in San Francisco because of the Cuban exile center of gravity in Miami. You've got a bunch in Miami. Looking internationally, I think that there's some really like so Jeremy Verone down at the New School has done some really interesting work looking at comparisons of Red Army faction, and so now you start looking at German and Italian radical leftists in the same time period, and I think that Professor Verone would be the expert to ask about those comparisons. But yeah, this isn't just happening in New York. It's not even just happening in the United States. It's happening elsewhere. What I would say is this, and it's the argument I make in the book, is that nowhere, there are bombings going off elsewhere, but nowhere in the world and nowhere else in a time period of history is the diversity of bombers as much as it is in New York City. You go from the police commissioner in 1969 or 1970 actually talks about the bombings happening in gigantic proportions in New York when he's testifying before Senate, and that's not just the Weather Underground. That's not just the Minutemen. The range of actors that and the range of bombers that I look at in the book. There's Croatian nationalist and Puerto Rican nationalist and Cuban exiles and radical left wingers and radical right wingers and the Jewish Defense League, and everybody's got a bomb. And there are bombings elsewhere in the country and elsewhere in the world, but nowhere else has that remarkable variety, a staggering variety of bombers. There are some newspapers I found in 70 and 71 where it'd be like a Jewish Defense League bombing on page 2 and then like a Cuban exile bombing on page 7. Not just different bombings, but radically different ends of the socio-political spectrum.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a fair question to throw at you, but I'm not quite sure that just like from the rooting around I did like in the Nixon administration when they had, and I can't remember the name of the it wasn't the it wasn't Kerner, obviously. It was another commission that was like the Paley Commission in 1970 about political violence. I'm not even sure there was a sense for whether they understood that in the White House, right? Because Moynihan has a slight hand in that and is going through the numbers. And of course, all the conversation among within the cabinet is just about sort of the Weather Underground types and the Panthers, and they're obsessed.
Exclusively.
Yeah,
Exclusively, yeah. And to specifically to the question of Oakland that that we were asked, I would say that I disaggregate the Black Panthers from terrorists and bombings from some of like the radical offshoots from of the Panthers, like the Black Liberation Army.
yeah, yeah,
According to Hoover, the Panthers were massively dangerous and violent, which I don't believe the evidence bears to be true. So Oakland, there was not a whole lot of bombings because the Panthers really weren't bombing anything.
yeah,
It was only some radical offshoots of the Panthers, like the Black Liberation Army, who were bombing things, and not just bombing things, they're also assassinating cops. It was, pretty scary bunch. But Oakland, I wouldn't say is a hub of this kind of political activity or political violence for that reason.
Are there groups that are tracking right-wing violence in this period? Alan Lovler's asking whether or not the Southern Poverty Law Center or any group like that was, because of course there was all this attention to Birmingham and to the Klan, the Citizens Councils, the neo-Nazis.
I think that a lot of good research has been done on them since. I don't know that anyone was tracking it at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, like as we mentioned, like even ACLU, and I'm forgetting the name of the center, but even cataloging, um, lynchings in
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I
going
know what
from
you're
the Jim
talking
Crow
about.
era to up into the 1960s. None of these numbers were captured. None of these stories were captured and kind of sort of lost into history, unfortunately. A lot of that work has been done since,
Yeah,
not necessarily in this kind of form, but there are researchers out there really digging in to try and unpack that, and that's yeoman's work. And to your point, by the time they're looking at it at the White House, or at Senate, political violence meant leftist political violence. You know, um, Nowhere are we talking about the right-wing violence that you and I are talking about here. Nowhere is that really drawing blood or interest at the federal level. Don't get me wrong, people cared, but God, the Weather Underground blows up a bank and nobody gets hurt, and everyone is screaming bloody murder. Don't get me wrong, Weather Underground also hurt people and killed themselves. Um,
yeah,
but the 16th Street Baptist Church and four little girls die, and there's no Senate investigation of that.
yeah, yeah,
Klan is blowing up civil rights institutions like that in
yeah,
Birmingham.
yeah.
I'll get off my high horse about that though.
No, it's a bigger. Well, I mean, what's disturbing about that is this loss is disturbing about that. I don't know if this is just a reflection of my weird zigzag my mind does, but I think about the Weimar years where it was a very similar story. What the Nazis and other sort of groups getting prosecuted in very low numbers when they were doing the vast majority of they were
Yeah.
responsible for the vast majority of deaths.
And
Um,
that's just to interrupt for a second. So, like, I would say two things. One, I don't want anyone who hasn't read the book yet to think that the book is just, an apologia for people on the left and this indictment of everyone on the right who's engaging
just
in
not.
violence. There's
Yeah,
a lot of violence going around, and there's a lot of blame to go around. Um, Police and the FBI are many, I think, are engaged in really trying to do good work for the public, and some of them are breaking the law. And then for as many people who are active on the left and the right, there are some who are engaging in violence. Nobody's immune. Nobody has good excuses for blowing up the stuff that they're blowing up, but
yeah,
everybody's doing it.
yeah. R11 asks, what about the Puerto Rican independence movement? There were some bombings in the 70s. Are they part of the story?
100%. And thank you for bringing it up. So the Puerto Rican independence movement goes through a couple of manifestations, and I try and track them in the book. And as we arrive on FALN, and this is a case that I actually talked to the Joint Terrorism Task Force about this when I was in there a few years ago. So you look at Puerto Rican independence from FALN to Omega 7 and FALN, or I think Brian Burrow made this claim, and he's not wrong, that they're the most prolific bombers in American history.
Yeah,
Um,
I think I've read that.
nobody unleashes as many bombs as the FALN does, moving from the late 70s, from the mid 70s into the late 70s. Nobody. And they are deadly. They are targeting cops. They are targeting New Yorkers. They are targeting everyone. Deadly bombings. We just this January had the 50th anniversary of the bombing of Fraunces Tavern, which is one of the oldest bars and taverns in New York and in the entire United States. Fraunces Tavern, which was in the shadow of the World Trade Center until the Trade Center came down, was a bar where George Washington celebrated with his officers after the war. FALN, Puerto Rican nationalists, bombed it in January of 1975. So we just passed the 50th anniversary, killed 4 people and wounded like 100. Pretty powerful bombs. And it actually came down that the sh flying shrapnel from the plates and flying forks and knives were just ripping people to shreds. And this is just their warning shot. They go forward over the course of the next 5 or 6 years to targeting cops again. They're anyway, yeah, Puerto Rican nationalists do claim a very heavy spot in the book. And it's an important part of the story. It's as I was talking about earlier, it's as terrorism goes from we want to get into the front pages, we don't necessarily need to kill anyone, to we're not scared of killing people, we're actually going to start targeting them.
Yeah. Um, Margot Jazz asks, do you see the continuous mass shootings as analogous to bombings? It is, for example, easier to get a gun than it is to get dynamite. It's terrifying, but is it terrorism? How do these compare to radical movements of the left or right?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've actually thought about that a lot before. It is way easier to get an AR-15 than it is to get a stick of dynamite. It's a really good question. So the way that I define terrorism is that you're not blowing up a bank, you're not blowing up a bunch of people or whatever it might be because of the actual targets therein. It's really just about using the violence to spread a message. With a gun, sometimes it's more specific. Uh, the young man who has been charged with assassinating Charlie Kirk intended to kill Charlie Kirk, not about spreading a message about something else. Charlie Kirk was his target. In Fraunces Tavern, the 4 people who died were just a vessel. And this isn't to devalue their lives at all, but they were a vessel from which to get the message forward. FALN issued a communique that same day, and it was because people died that everyone started putting this message on the front pages. It's a little bit different. I think that when you look at the assault on, for instance, the Pulse nightclub in Florida a bunch of years ago, that's a gun and that's terrorism because none of those victims were the individual targets of that violence, but the violence was so specifically aimed at the gay community that the message was the violence, and it also happened to involve a gun, and it also happened to involve several innocent people losing their lives.
Yeah. Um, so we have a question since Francis Tavern is on the just address the question from Francie who asks about the rebels in 1776 in New York pulling down the statue of King George in Bowling Green. Would that be considered a terrorist act? Uh, I would say that that's destruction of property, but of course at the time it was the king, so it probably would have been considered a terrorist act.
Something I always ask my students at John Jay is, and it's actually something that Beverly Gage brought up, I think, writing in Journal of American History years ago, was that, hey man, is the Boston Tea Party terrorism? Same thing. And I don't know that the destruction of property isn't uh, violence. You
Mm,
know, you blow up a bank and there's nobody inside of it. All you're doing is breaking glass and furniture. That's destruction of property, and that's also violence. So I'm not sure. I think that pulling down a statue, probably whatever the threshold is, I don't think that that it meets it. I think it's a great question because it's the same exact question I asked about the Boston Tea Party. I will say this, had the British won the war and they knew who was involved in the Boston Tea Party or in pulling down that statue, they're all swinging from a tree.
100%. 100%. Um, uh, they executed several people in the city when there was a fire that they thought that the rebels set
Yeah.
weeks later. Um, uh, Question from Ibrahim Bekruri. The history of political violence in the U.S. is also a history of political assassinations. Think Fred Hampton or Malcolm X. And the intersection with law enforcement and intelligence. Can you speak about that and maybe talk about the risks of this happening today? Thinking specifically about threats around the mayor-elect.
Yeah, so Fred Hampton is, I think that Malcolm X and Fred Hampton are both very tragic cases of two very powerful voices in the Black American community separated by just a few years. I also think they're a little bit different. If for anyone who's listening who doesn't know about the Fred Hampton case, Fred Hampton was one of the very young, very influential, and very charismatic leaders of the Black Panthers in Chicago. Um, who was killed in what can only be described as a police raid that looked a lot more like a gangland assassination in with while he's laying in bed next to his
5 in the morning, right?
yeah, but in the middle of the night, been drugged by an FBI informant, and laying in bed next to his girlfriend at the time, who was 8 months pregnant. The dude was drugged. He had no idea what was happening. Anyway, but you take that and you compare that to the assassination of Malcolm X. Conspiracy theories aside, there's no credible evidence that anyone involved in law enforcement was involved in the assassination of Malcolm X. Not going to say the same thing about the killing of Fred Hampton. And I look now at threats that are proliferate against the mayor-elect. Threats are real, I think. He's the mayor-elect has, I think, inspired a lot of people on both sides of the political spectrum. I don't know that I would say any law enforcement or intelligence or government agency is would be complicit in those activities. I will say a lot of negative things about the current occupants of power in Washington, D.C. That they would be involved in assassination of political leaders in the United States is not something that's not somewhere I'm going to go just yet.
Yeah, I'm not sure the current set are there yet. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I also there's a lot of things I didn't believe, would be happening today a year ago. So, stay tuned. But
yeah, I think there's a bit of a John the Baptist factor going on.
yeah, unfortunately.
Um, William Herbert asks, was Sam Melville's compatriot George Demery a member of the Minutemen?
That is, oh man, that is a if it's a great story. Not it's a fascinating story. I don't know if great's the right word. So George Demerly was a member of the Minutemen. He was a pretty radical right winger who decided to offer up his services to the FBI as weirdly as an infiltrator of the radical left. And this is a story I tell in the book. And because of the voracious appetite for all kinds of information on the radical left, the FBI is like, sure, crazy right winger, go underground in the radical left. And lo and behold, he's actually massively successful. George Demerly becomes a close compatriot of Abbie Hoffman. He's a well-known, if not respected, respect is not the right word, but he's a well-known radical leftist, and he becomes a linchpin as an FBI informant to unraveling Sam Melville's bombing conspiracy in 1969. Really, really interesting character. Was legitimately a hardcore left right winger and a member of the Minutemen. Not charged in any bombings or anything like that, but was a member of the Minutemen. So it's as far right as you could get without going, committing crimes. And then becomes a well-known and well-liked radical leftist in New York before, unfortunately, or ultimately having to surface because of because of the charges against Sam Melville. The FBI, this is an anecdote from the book, the FBI tries to maintain his cover after Sam Melville and everyone is arrested, and actually sends Demerly to jail to try and gather more information from Melville. Melville kind of put it two and two together at this point, and instead of giving him more information, offers him a beat down. So the FBI at that point pulls him out of jail because they know that the game is up. And then Demerly, it kind of sends shockwaves through the radical left that someone as well known as George Demerly would be an FBI informant. And that's kind of why a lot of organizations in the next couple of years, like the Weather Underground, start going through these purges to really sort of root out other
Yeah.
informants and Asian provocateurs and infiltrators.
Yeah. Um, so we've got a bunch of questions here in just a few minutes. I'm going to try to kind of see if we can zip through some of these. Lucas
Sure.
asks, do you think we'll see the same thing in the future with the politics of the right-wing violence today sort of being erased and just the left-wing violence being inflated? I mean, I would say we're not fortune tellers, but anything is possible. Uh,
My short answer to that would be that there is a concerted effort, obviously, to do that
yeah,
at the levers of national power. Obviously, with trying to designate something like Antifa as a terrorist organization, which is stupid on so many levels, but also to pardon January 6th
yeah,
people.
yeah.
So yeah, there's an effort to do that, but I think that that game is up. I don't think that none of us, reasonable people who can see things 360 degrees are interested in letting that happen.
I mean, this is part of what's implied when you say like one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, right?
Yeah. And
Uh,
I don't believe that that's true. I think a terrorist is a terrorist is a terrorist.
sure. Yeah.
Be he agree with all of my politics. If you're blowing up a bomb,
Yeah.
um, hey man, I might agree with your politics, but
Yep.
you're a terrorist.
Somebody asks about, I guess, my comment about Nixon administration looking the other way with right-wing terrorism. It's basically a variation of what we were just talking about here. Is terrorism finance easier? Another asks, is terrorism financing easier to track now than it was in, say, the 1990s? That's a question that you can answer, maybe, not me.
Yeah, I mean that's putting on like my Intel professionals hat. I haven't done a lot of this stuff for the organizations I've done it for. The answer is yes. The answer is that even something as world changing, and that is not an exaggeration, but world changing as 9/11 cost a couple $100,000.
Yeah,
The
right.
Boston Marathon bombing was done for the cost of a nice suit. Terrorism doesn't cost a lot of money,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah. Part of the attraction. Someone else asks about comment I made about the Goldwater comparison. I won't go into all the details, but I meant the specific tactics, direct mail, et cetera, the way they manipulated the convention system, primary systems. Jim asks, can you talk about airline hijackings at the time? Slightly diagonal, but is there a relation?
Yeah, totally. So sometimes hijackings happen so much that the case I make in the book is that sometimes they're reported like pollen counts. Oh, there was less hijackings this week than there were last week, and they're happening all the time. But again, like just like terrorism is perceived to be so much deadlier now because of seeing it through the lens of, Oklahoma City than 9/11, terrorism is crazy deadly now. We also see airline hijacking as being way deadlier. Back in the 70s, a lot of times people would hijack a liner, have them fly to Cuba, they would release a bunch of pamphlets, and then they get off a plane. So they happened a lot more. And just like a lot of restrictions on dynamite in our day and age come out of this era, a lot of the restrictions you see when you go to airports are what they are because of the hijackings that happened back then. One of the anecdotes to tell in the story is that Sam Melville actually learned how to build bombs from a Canadian or Quebecois separatist who he and his compatriots helped to hijack a plane to escape to Cuba, or they
Hmm.
helped them plan it. They didn't actually get on the plane and do it. So yeah,
Hmm.
there's definitely some linkages there, and there's a great book by the name of "The Skies Belong to Us" on that if you guys are interested as well. You know,
Hmm.
just trying to sell you guys a bunch of books that you're not my own, I guess.
Absolutely. No, no, no. This is the book. We're gonna try to sell it for you, David. Everyone should go
Thank
out
you.
and buy this book. You have our link in the advert on our website, and we hope that you will buy directly from the publisher because Jeff Bezos has enough money.
Jeff
Um,
Bezos got enough money. Go to
yeah,
your local bookshops if you're in New
go to your
York.
local bookshop.
Yeah,
That's important to the people who actually write the history like us. Um, It's not just that we don't like Jeff. I want to say congratulations, David. It's a great book. I want to tell everybody in the audience it's actually like a very, really well written book too, as I was saying before we got on the air. I'm very impressed with the writing. You will cruise through this, and there's lots of juicy stories that we actually really didn't get into about all these colorful characters, at times even sort of comical characters, definitely dark and disturbing characters, to and a big subject that unfortunately we'll probably have to think about more and more in the future.
and the very last, thank you for all that, Peter, and thank you for everyone who's here. The last thing I would say is also this is a New York story, you know? Like this is all happening in this wild time in New York's history that I think is just like it just makes for this very colorful background. So if you haven't read the book, I hope you do, and I hope you enjoy it. And thank you guys for all joining me tonight. And thank you, Peter, for all of this and everything over the last couple of years.
Absolutely, my pleasure always. And I will say goodnight to you all. Hope you will join us for our next talk. David, I will see you soon. And I want to thank you all for joining us and hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Good night, guys, and happy holidays.